talk about the beautiful business of milk today. Yeah, yeah. I got milk. Let's talk about milk. Oh yeah, baby, let's talk about the beautiful business of milk today.
This episode of Got Milk is sponsored by Shunya Agritech, the folks revolutionizing cattle nutrition with hydroponic green fodder. Visit their website at shunya.live for more details, or download the Shunya app from Play Store or App Store.
All right, let's jump right in today. We're doing a deep dive into the world of dairy farming in India. Well, more specifically, we're going to be looking at a 2024 research article from the Journal of Scientific Research and Reports. And basically, it's a study on the knowledge and practices of dairy farmers in Uttar Pradesh.
Oh, yeah, I read that one. It's a pretty interesting look at a region that's, really crucial for global milk production. Even if you've, never even been close to a farm, I think it just gives you a much better understanding of just how complicated our food systems actually are.
Yeah, for sure. The study itself is pretty dense, but we've gone through it and pulled out some of the things we thought were the most interesting to talk about today.
Yeah, one of the first things that kind of jumped out at me was just how much India dominates the global dairy market. Like, did you know that in 2023, they produced over 230 million tons of milk?
Whoa, that's a lot of milk. I mean, that really shows just how important dairy farming is, not just for India's economy, but for millions of people, especially in rural areas.
Right. For a lot of low and middle income households, dairy farming isn't just a job. It's a lifeline, provides income, food security. It's a way out of poverty for some people.
So let's get into the actual study. The researchers were looking at what they call good dairy farming practices, right? What does that actually mean?
Good question. I mean, it's a pretty broad term, but basically what it means is a set of practices that aim to improve efficiency, sustainability, and, making sure that the animals are treated ethically, things like hygienic milking procedures, breeding techniques, balanced feeding, healthy living environment for the animals, all that kind of falls under that term.
And what the study found is that there are some pretty big knowledge gaps, at least when it comes to these practices, among farmers in Uttar Pradesh.
Yeah, and some of the findings are kind of surprising. Like, most of the farmers, they understood how important it was to feed colostrum to calves, like newborn calves. That's the first milk, that's full of antibodies. But only about a third of them knew about the diseases that humans can get from drinking raw milk.
That's a pretty big difference. It makes you wonder why there's such a disconnect between animal health and human health in that way.
Yeah, it really does. I think it shows that we need to understand how information gets shared within these farming communities. It's not just about giving them the information. It's about understanding, what they already believe, how they do things, and then figuring out how to fit the new information into that.
Yeah, I see what you mean. The study also found some interesting differences when it came to breeding. For example, over 80% of the farmers, they knew about the heat cycle. So that's when a cow's ready for breeding, but less than 40% knew the best time for artificial insemination.
Right. That's a huge difference. And it can really affect how successful breeding is and overall how productive the farm is.
Yeah. So it seems like there's a gap between knowing the biological basics.
Yeah.
And understanding the more technical stuff that actually makes a difference.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And this is where training and resources are super important. If they had the knowledge and the skills to use these more advanced techniques, it could really help them be more successful.
Totally. Another finding I found interesting was pretty much every farmer knew how many workers you need for 5 cows, which makes sense. That's practical knowledge. But less than 20% of them kept records of their farming activities.
That is interesting. I mean, keeping records might seem like just an admin thing, but it's really important for managing a farm well. Without accurate records of, how much milk they're producing, breeding cycles, feeding schedules, health issues, it's hard to see where they can improve, make good decisions, even track if they're making any money.
So it's like something that could be holding them back. Why do you think these gaps exist? Is it just about access to information?
Access is definitely part of it. Even now, there are still lots of rural communities that don't have good internet access, so it's harder for them to find information and resources. But it's not just about the information being available. It's also about whether it's relevant to them and how it's presented.
So it's like more than just having the information. It's got to be the right information, and they got to be able to, like, use it, right?
Exactly. And another thing to consider is tradition. Like in a lot of these communities, farming knowledge is passed down, through generations. So there can be some pushback, when you're asking them to change how they've always done things, especially when it's how they make a living.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you can't just expect people to, like, completely change overnight.
Right, exactly. And it's super important to, be sensitive to that. It's not about saying their traditional knowledge is wrong. It's about trying to find a way to, like, blend the old and the new. Find what works best from both.
Couldn't that also be part of the problem with, like, the record-keeping thing? If a farmer's always just, relied on their memory and experience to manage their herd, suddenly telling them to write everything down or even use a computer program, that's got to be overwhelming, right?
That's a good point. Actually, the study mentions a specific example of this, like clash between traditional practices and modern science. They found that a lot of farmers still just, look at the cows to figure out when they're in heat, even though there are more accurate methods like hormone tests.
So it's not that they don't know about the tests, it's that they, like, trust their own way more.
Exactly. They trust their own judgment, their own experience, more than they trust this new technology. And that's why just giving them the information isn't enough. We need to show them that these new approaches actually work, that they can benefit from them.
The study also talks about money being a problem.
Mhm.
Like, it's got to be hard for farmers, especially small farms, to invest in, new equipment, training, all that stuff.
For sure. A lot of these practices, they're good in the long run, but they cost money up front. New equipment, better infrastructure, even just the time it takes to learn the new stuff and start using it. And if a farmer is already struggling to make ends meet, it's tough to justify spending more.
Really, it's like a catch-22. They need to make more money to improve, but they need to improve to make more money. How do you, like, get out of that? What can be done to help them, bridge these knowledge gaps and actually use these practices?
This study mentions a few things. One is strengthening agricultural extension services. Basically, these are programs where experts go out to the communities and work directly with the farmers, giving them training, advice, and access to the latest research.
So, like, bringing the knowledge and resources to them instead of expecting them to go find it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important that these services are designed for that specific community. A one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. They also suggest focusing on the practical problems that the farmers are facing.
What do you mean by practical problems?
Well, for example, if a farmer can't read, giving them a booklet about new breeding techniques won't help. Or if a farmer is struggling to buy animal feed, they won't be able to buy expensive new equipment, even if they understand the benefits.
So it's got to be tailored to each farmer's situation. You got to meet them where they're at.
Exactly. Understand their situation, address their needs, and support them in making these changes in a way that works for them.
The study also talks about the role of government programs.
Right. A lot of governments offer financial help or subsidies to farmers who adopt these good practices. But the problem is these programs are often hard to understand or hard to access, especially for smaller farmers who might not be able to, read all the complicated rules or deal with the paperwork.
It's not enough to just have the program, right?
Yeah.
You got to make sure the farmers know about it and can actually use it.
Exactly. Clear communication and easy-to-use processes are super important.
That's where local cooperatives and NGOs can be really helpful, right?
Absolutely. They can be the link between the government and the farmers. They can spread the word about the programs, help farmers apply for them, and even offer support in putting the practices into action. They can also create a space for farmers to share their own knowledge and experiences, which is super valuable, especially when you're trying to bridge that gap between tradition and science.
So it sounds like it takes a team effort. Researchers, policymakers, extension workers, NGOs, and of course the farmers themselves, all working together to build a better dairy industry.
That's it. It's about creating a system that supports farmers so they can adopt these practices, not just for them, but for the animals, the environment, and ultimately for all of us who rely on a healthy food system.
So we've talked a lot about these challenges and solutions, but what about the bigger picture? What does all this mean for people who aren't farmers?
That's a good question. What I take away from this is that what we're seeing in India, it's not just an India problem. Access to information, tradition versus science, economic pressures, those are challenges for dairy farmers all over the world, even in developed countries.
So even though the study was focused on India, it tells us something about our food systems as a whole.
Exactly. It shows how important it is to invest in agricultural research, extension services, and programs that help farmers all around the world. We need to recognize that a strong agricultural sector is important for everyone, not just the farmers. It's about food security for everyone and keeping our planet healthy.
It's about understanding that our food system is all connected and that supporting farmers is crucial for a sustainable future. But let's zoom back in for a second and think about the people involved.
Yeah, it's important to remember that behind all the data and research, there are real people whose lives are tied to dairy farming. These are families who depend on their cows for income, food, their whole way of life.
And those families are dealing with some tough challenges. We've talked about knowledge gaps and money problems, but are there other pressures they're facing?
One big one is the milk market itself. The price of milk is often controlled by big companies or the government, which means farmers don't have much say in how much they earn.
So even if they're producing good quality milk, using all the right practices, they might not be getting a fair price for it.
Exactly. And that can make it really tough for them to plan for the future, make improvements, or even just make ends meet. Plus, the cost of everything is going up: feed, vet care, even labor.
So they're getting hit from both sides, low milk prices and higher costs. It's no wonder so many are struggling.
It's a serious problem, and it makes it even harder for them to invest in those good practices we've been talking about. It's that catch-22 again.
Yeah.
They need more money to do better, but they need to do better to make more money.
So how do we break out of that cycle? How do we create a dairy industry that's fair and sustainable for everyone involved?
Well, there's no easy answer, but I think the study gives us some good ideas. We need to address those knowledge gaps, invest in extension services that are accessible, relevant, and designed for the specific needs of each community, support farmer cooperatives, and create policies that encourage sustainable practices. And we need to do all of this while being mindful of the realities these farmers are facing. It's a complicated challenge, but I think we can solve it if we work together.
I agree. It's about finding that balance between tradition and progress, between supporting individual farmers and strengthening the whole system.
Exactly. It's about creating a dairy industry that is productive and efficient, but also fair and sustainable.
Speaking of fair and sustainable, we've talked a lot about the economic side of things for the farmers, but what about the ethical side, like for the animals?
Yeah.
This study focused on knowledge and practices, but it didn't really get into the well-being of the cows themselves.
Right. That's a really important point. When we talk about good dairy farming practices, it's not just about efficiency and, how much milk they produce. It's also about treating the animals well, making sure they're, taken care of.
Yeah, it makes you think, what do the cows think about all this?
Yeah.
We're talking about their lives, their milk,
There's a growing movement to start thinking about farm animals differently, to see them as, sentient beings, to recognize that they have their own needs, and we should respect that.
But how do you measure a cow's well-being? I mean, they can't exactly tell us how they're feeling.
That's the tough part. But researchers are coming up with new ways to figure that out, looking at their behavior, their physiology, even their facial expressions. It's about going beyond just, preventing obvious cruelty and really trying to understand what it means for a farm animal to actually thrive.
So it's about seeing the individual animals, not just
Yeah.
the milk production numbers.
Exactly. And it's about asking ourselves, are we doing this right? Can we produce milk in a way that's ethical and sustainable?
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've learned so much about dairy farming, the challenges farmers are facing, and what we can do to create a more sustainable system.
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. Hopefully it's made everyone think a little bit more about where their food comes from.
Absolutely. We've talked about knowledge gaps, communication, support systems, but I think the biggest takeaway for me is the need for empathy.
Empathy.
Yeah, empathy for the farmers, for the animals, and even for ourselves as consumers trying to make good choices in a, pretty complicated world.
That's a great way to put it. It's about seeing the bigger picture and approaching these issues with compassion.
So to wrap things up, we'll leave you with this thought. We've explored how much dairy farmers know, what affects their practices, and what it means for the planet and animal welfare. But here's the question. As we all become more aware of these things, will we be willing to pay more for milk that's produced in a way that, aligns with our values? And if so, how do we make those choices available to everyone, not just those who can afford it? That's something to think about. And we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.